Today, we have some incredible guests joining us who are going to share their knowledge and expertise around how we can increase the focus and attention on diversity and inclusion in social care. My name is Danielle. I'm also the D&I champion at QCS. At QCS, diversity and inclusion are really more than just words to us. They are central to our values, and they're at the core of everything we do. They guide who we recruit and how we do what we do all day, every day. And our customers are also incredibly diverse, and we really strive to reflect that in the diversity inside our virtual walls or dining rooms, as it is now, I suppose. I'm very honored to be your host today. But before we get into the questions, it would be great just to do a quick around the room so that you can introduce yourselves. And Kiran, can we start with you, please?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kiran Johnson. I'm the Managing Director of a consultancy called DKJ Support Services. We are health and social care experts, but we specialise within compliance, health inequalities, and also bid management. Thank you so much for asking myself to be here today. Looking forward to what will be a healthy debate, I imagine, in the next hour.
Lovely, thank you. And Jane?
Hi everybody, I'm Jane Brightman. I'm the General Manager for Social Care at the Institute of Health and Social Care Management. And yeah, really excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Lovely, thank you. And Hilary?
Hi there, I'm Hilary Woodhead. I'm NAPA's Executive Director. We are a national charity that supports the sector to prioritise wellbeing, and absolutely central to that is ensuring that people have the opportunity to be who they are. So I'm very, very pleased to be here and joining this discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And you have Mike with you.
Hi everybody, my name is Mike Phillips. I'm a freelance trainer, consultant, facilitator and coach. I'm an associate with a number of organisations, including Meaningful Care Matters, and I'm an associate trainer for NAPA, and also delighted to be their advisor in LGBT plus inclusivity. And it's great to be here for this important topic.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Vic.
I'm Vic Rayner. I'm the Chief Exec of the National Care Forum, which is a membership body for not-for-profit care providers. And I think this is an absolutely critical debate in terms of thinking about how social care best addresses and supports the needs of people who are LGBTQ. And from a personal interest, delighted as a gay woman to be part of a discussion that will hopefully shape and reshape services of the future, that I'll be able to use.
Perfect, thank you. Now on to our first discussion point, which is probably the most important question, is why is it important to focus on LGBTQ plus within the service provision? So does anyone want to open up the panel and give us your first thoughts?
I'm happy to.
Thanks.
So yeah, for me, I think it's about building confidence, you know, with people who work in social care and people who draw on it, and families. And I think we need to feel more confident to talk more openly and to feel a bit more curious and to ask questions and to, you know, start to shape the services that we provide and the way that we want to be supported, and to help people to ask the questions and just feel like it's not something that they can't talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've gone on that journey with mental health and breaking the stigma, and there's obviously more areas where we can explore that in terms of gaining confidence. Thanks for sharing.
I think, Danielle, I think we've probably got to think pretty quickly about this. Clearly, you know, there are many services out there, thousands of services, and I think from having worked with organisations like Opening Doors London and our local Age UK and a whole range of, in previous life, a whole range of housing services, you know, the level of disconnect that I think a lot of people who identify as LGBTQ plus feel with those services is huge. And actually, when we talk about person-centred care being at the heart of everything that we do, and yet the model of service provision, the language that we use, that, you know, very basic things like the sort of, you know, the assumptions that are made about people's relationships when they come into services. I mean, these are things we've been talking about, well, I've been talking about for 30 years, and yet there is still kind of a really, there's a kind of, you know, there's a real divide. And I think that's, you know, that's, we've got to, I suppose the sense of urgency is that, you know, we've got, certainly in the context of ageing, we've got a growing cohort of people who identify as LGBTQ plus, who need to access services. We've obviously got a growing group of younger people who identify in that cohort, who will be coming into working age services. And I think the things that people need, and the things that people need to support their identity, and people's identity being a huge part of themselves and their lives, we're not catering for very well. I mean, there's very few services out there that are specifically for this community, and not a huge amount of others. You know, I can think on one hand of others who actively really promote and engage their support for LGBTQ+, and that's not good enough.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us, Nadra. It's good to see you.
Sorry to be late.
No problem at all. We've had one question so far, and we're just talking through that. So the question at hand at the moment is, why is it important to focus on LGBTQ+ within the service provision? And we're just sort of discussing through our thoughts on that at the moment.
I'd like to add to a lot of the great points that have been made, that yes, it is about person-centered care, as Vic said, and I think it is about, obviously, we have an Equality Act, so legally we are obliged to as a sector. And I think there's a sort of moral and social responsibility in the same way that we would think of being inclusive of people who are from the Black and ethnic minority community. And I think the urgency that Vic mentions is what's really pressing for me as a 54-year-old gay man, because I'm thinking things need to change an awful lot and very quickly before I may need to be on the receiving end of some of those services. And I know it's really easy to bandy around stats, but some very brief stats from some research done a couple of years ago by the charity Stonewall, that said that almost half of the LGBT+ people questioned felt that they would be uncomfortable being out to care home staff. Almost half. 3 in 5 are not comfortable that care and support services would actually meet their needs, and 81% of bisexual women and men think of their friends as their family, and certainly I know I've experienced that with older gay relatives. My late uncle, who was gay, he really had so much fear about anybody having to come into his home and what he might have to hide. And the classic thing, which I've mentioned on other things that I've taken part in for me, was the fact that he had 2 single beds, and his partner of 50 years had died. And when I asked, why have you still got 2 single beds, he said. And he said, well, that's because when we were gay, he and his partner were very out, but he said, when we were gay in the 50s, the couple, we had to have the single beds in case we were raided by the police. And I think so therefore, as well as thinking about what we need to do about services, we need to make ourselves aware of the experiences of older LGBT+ individuals that have a perception about what sort of level of care they may receive.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Mike. This is about allowing people as they, you know, either grow older or require care, to be able to live authentically in whoever and whatever that may be. And I think it's a great point around the history of where we've come from and what we still need to do, and understanding we're at the very kind of beginning. And, you know, to Vic's point, we're at the start of this. There's so much more to do. Thanks for sharing, obviously, some harrowing stats, but it's definitely thought-provoking too. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Any other thoughts?
I just wanted to kind of add on all of our guest speakers' kind of thoughts, really. You know, thinking about, you know, the question is why is it important to focus on LGBTQ+ provision? that's a question that was first asked. And my background has been working in public sector in probably areas that maybe are seen as not being as diverse in the broadest sense as well. And and I'm sure you've all heard the terminology where it says, our services are inclusive for all. And I think it's a point that Mike picked up on. But what does that actually mean in reality, and what does that actually mean in terms of service provision for not just the LGBTQ plus community, but also for all of the protected groups under the Equality Act as well? We know that there is a lot of support, social care support available, for example, ethnic minorities or for people with disabilities. But actually, what support is available for people from this community that they actually feel comfortable, safe in accessing? So actually, a question that maybe we should be asking ourselves, either as service providers or wanting to access those services, is that statement that we are accessible and inclusive for all, does that really ring true as an organisation, as a service provider or somebody accessing those services? And maybe that's where it's breaking through that wall of actually, well, maybe this service isn't accessible and inclusive as well. So just something for me is about, to focus on LGBT provision is actually looking about what is that provision, and actually is that go under that banner of we are inclusive for all.
Yeah, a really good point again. I mean, it's the transparency, isn't it? We can say we're diverse, we can say we're inclusive, but who says so? We'd all like to write our own reviews, I'm sure, but it's how do we show that this is who we are and that it is a safe place, and that's diversity and inclusion for all. That's not necessarily just LGBTQ plus people and individuals. I think this is a broader topic as well in terms of that transparency. Anyone else, any thoughts on that? It's a very open question.
Sorry to be late. So, but just picking up from what I've just heard, I think for me, there's also the comfort zone of the workforce and how we are actually educating them to understand what we mean by that inclusivity, because I would hate to think that what we keep thinking is that it needs to be a special treatment of some sort. I think it has to be something that is the norm. And I think that's partly to do with the discomfort by the workforce of not understanding. So have we got the right training materials? Have we got the right resources to support the workforce to actually understand what we mean? And what we expect, and how do we expect to transition to that? So, in older people's services, they come from that era that, Mike was just describing, potentially much, and before, where it was not the acceptable routes of the world. And so, in a care setting with that sort of peer group, how do we then manage that? Because that is a totally different world. If you're looking at LD services, if you're looking at services with other forms of disability, we've got to think about that as well. So there isn't a one size fits all in all of this, but I think it is based around the resource, because I feel, having been a provider in the 80s and the 90s, for 24 years, it was not something that we were required to even bring awareness for our staff. There was all the statutory training responsibilities and all of that, but it was not something that was brought about. And I'm not sure that it's changed that much since the time that I came out of the sector, and other colleagues might tell me differently. So I think there is something about us supporting our workforce so that they feel comfortable in that themselves, because some of them might be feeling the same root of discomfort as well, and we're just not looking at it in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think for me as well, there's something about this all very well to put on a training course, and I know this is something that me and Mike have talked about late into the night, but actually if your policies and procedures aren't in place and there isn't the leadership to say that this is something that we must prioritise, and maybe we do need to prioritise it so that it can become the norm and embedded into everyday practice, there's a lot of work to do first in, as Mike would say, preparing the ground. And I think that where sometimes it starts with a discussion and then there's the development of the policy and the procedure and then the training course, where you begin doesn't need to, we can start at different places and just start to have the conversation. But I think having an expectation that staff are inclusive without being clear about what that expectation is. And if we're not clear, are we all really clear? If we're not clear, how on earth do we expect the workforce to be? And then how can we expect people's experience to be a positive one, and for them to feel that actually they are valued and that they do feel like they belong, and that, you know, people do want to spend time with them and understand them. So it's all picture. It's all, you know, I agree with everything you said. It's that whole picture, isn't it? It's
yeah.
And
who in the team feels comfortable enough to support the workforce, because it's not about championing, but who feels comfortable enough.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the other thing is not to forget that the workforce is full of people who identify as LGBTQ plus. You know, that's the other bit of it, isn't it? Is that actually, you know, yes, there's something very definitely about leadership, and I think that point's really well made, Hilary. That, you know, this is about absolutely making it clear that, you know, what person-centered care means in that context, but also recognizing that if you create an environment that's inclusive for people who receive care and support, you also create an environment that's inclusive for a workforce that it identifies as LGBTQ plus. And I think, you know, as a sector, if we're not doing everything possible to make this an inclusive workforce for everyone, then we're kind of missing a trick there, because we've got enough challenges on our plate in terms of workforce shortages.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the representation as well is a big point there, you know, because you've said you want to, as a care provider, or anyone in an industry, any company, you want to see someone that's like you. You want to see representation. You want to feel like you belong because someone else is kind of like you. So you feel welcome. You feel like you haven't got to hide anything. You know, that's a big step forward, I think, if you can find that. And you're right, there is it's a diverse workforce, as we've said. It's a very diverse sector. Mike?
I think it's just what's occurred to me in some of the things and all the great things that have been said is one of my big bones of contention. And it's I talk about it not being about the inclusivity, is not about the symbolic. And I think sometimes the mistake is made with LGBT plus inclusivity, is that organizations think that they can put up a lovely rainbow flag sticker or something like that, which is the symbolic, but it's actually the systemic, which is, to me, much more important. Because if you use this symbol of being inclusive, and then the reality of life for the service users, whatever term you might want to use, is that it's not inclusive. And it's not, I know I'm referring particularly to older people's care here, but going back to what I said earlier, you know, it's about having like Hilary talked about, the policies and the procedures. Because if we say our care home is inclusive, and yet we haven't decided what the policies and procedures are to deal with a situation where one resident in a care home is homophobic to another, which could potentially bring up safeguarding issues. You know, it's not just about stickers, basically. It's not just that symbol, it's about so much more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that leads on nicely to kind of the next discussion point is, how do we achieve a positive focus on LGBTQ plus service users and ensure that we're supporting people appropriately? So it's, you know, Nadra, to your comment earlier, it's not about necessarily, you know, it's about comfort zones. It's not normal. It's not special treatment. It's about how do we get this ingrained in companies? How do we get the training materials? So how do we achieve a positive focus on LGBTQ plus service users?
I just wanted to kind of reiterate what you've just said, Danielle. It's, you know, when I was thinking about this question about a positive focus, and I think positive is a great word, but actually, like I think you've just said, it should be the norm, whatever the norm be. But actually, you know, we all like to think that we're decent human beings, and we like to treat people as we'd like to be treated ourselves. And maybe that's a bit of a utopian sort of kind of, you know, paradise type of view, but that's that's the kind of what we're hoping to achieve, isn't it? So actually and I think it goes back to that personalized care, doesn't it? Where it's about, okay, you know, I may be from the LGBTQ plus community, but I also may be a woman from India, or I'm an Indian person, and I also may have a disability. So it's not just about also boxing off, like, you know, one particular characteristic. It's about actually looking at that person in their entirety and seeing, well, actually, you know, how is the best care that we can provide that person and the support that their wider family need to help to ensure that they provide that support for that person. So in my opinion, a positive, the question is a positive focus. The positive focus is actually looking at that person in their entirety rather than maybe looking at particular characteristics of themselves.
Yeah, really good point. Danielle, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say that, so I'm Danielle Rawcliffe, by the way. I'm from Napthens Solicitors. I'm an employment lawyer, and so I don't know a great deal about care itself, but I obviously advise organisations that do obviously provide care to people. And some of the points that people were just making about how do we communicate whatever policies we want to put into place is obviously very, very important. I think just to follow on from what Kiran was saying, I think it's important to, like you said, to look at the whole individual. And at one point I wanted to answer from before is that when we talk about equality, that doesn't necessarily mean treating everybody in exactly the same way, because like Mike was saying before, certain older service users who have got maybe a distrust, understandably, of institutions, of, you know, doctors, of carers, of authority figures for very good reasons, are going to be maybe harder nuts to crack and to try and get through to the person themselves in order for them to open up to you a bit. So I think my point was just going to be that equality doesn't necessarily mean treating everybody in exactly the same way. It's about, like Kiran was saying, acknowledging the people, whoever's in front of you, acknowledging their differences and what does set them apart and what you may need to do in order to sort of to address those and to assist in the best way you can. Yeah, 100%. I think someone said to me once, I think I'd said normalize, and they were like, you mean usualize? And I was like, yeah, you're right. I probably do mean usualize. It's that, you know, not everyone's the same, and you do need to consider everything about a person. You know, everything about them is important if you're making a decision, especially for their welfare and care. Absolutely relevant. Hilary, you had comments?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to what Danielle just said, really. I was just going to say about acknowledging but also appreciating the contributions of people that might identify as LGBTQ+. And I think in appreciating and celebrating contributions, I think then other people perhaps might have to question their own assumptions about who people are and about the sort of role they take within society. And I think particularly from NAPA's point of view, you know, we've spent quite a lot of time and effort encouraging the staff that we support, usually activity staff, to think about creatively about appreciating and acknowledging people's successes. Yes, their history, but also the things in their life that have been really special to them and unique in their experience, because there's learning in that, but that also in itself manages some of the assumptions and stereotypes that people that may be likely to support them might hold about them. So yes, we're all different, but what makes us different? Can we appreciate that difference and celebrate it wherever possible as well?
Great. Any other ideas on how we can put the positive focus, or what a good first step would be for any maybe smaller companies looking to make a difference, to make a change?
I think one of the things, for me, one of the starting points is actually, do we know our clients and service users? Do we ask them for a start? I can't tell you how many care homes I've worked with where they will say, oh, well, we don't have anybody here who's gay. And I said, well, how do you know that? Have you asked? No, we haven't. I think there's that. I just wanted to go back to Kiran's point as well about, you know, people being in boxes. And I often say on training, labels are for parcels, not for people. And there will be sort of crossover, you know, there will be all sorts of different crossovers that somebody is maybe LGBT+, but something else. And I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here as a guest here, so I may not be asked back, but I have a little bit of an issue about the inclusion of the Q. And I would not normally have a problem with the Q, but the Q stands for queer or questioning, and that is about reclaiming that banned word that was used very negatively in the past. But I usually suggest that we don't use the Q with older people, because I've worked with many people who have had the word queer used against them. I'm thinking about one lesbian woman who I worked with through Opening Doors that was mentioned earlier, actually. She and her girlfriend were called queer, and her girlfriend went on to be raped and then killed in front of her. So the reclaiming of the letter Q is kind. So I just wanted to point that out, because all these letters can be a bit confusing for anybody outside of the LGBT plus, as I would call, community. But I would just sort of add that that's why we really need people to understand the sort of experience. So the first positive step is actually finding out what is the lived experience of people who are LGBT plus, because our youngsters today, I support a charity called the Albert Kennedy Trust, which was set up because of a young lad whose parents threw him out because he was gay, and he was chased by homophobes to the top of a car park in Manchester, and he jumped to his death. That charity, which is set up in his memory, supports homeless young LGBT plus youngsters today who've been kicked out. So the homophobia is still here, but it's very different to the sorts of lived experiences that older people might have experienced, such as the couple of examples, albeit they may sound dramatic, but the sorts of experiences that people who are older that would have had in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Mike, what I'm hearing there is the power of language and how things change over time as well, and how that can have an impact. And obviously tragic stories, and you know, there once, you know, some of them that I've heard of, the Manchester one, that's fairly local to me, so it's very prominent. And one of the things that I am glad of is that there is charities, there is support, there is a section of this community and of the care sector that's trying to, you know, make sure that young people that identify within, you know, the community have support and guidance there, and have it as outside of their family. They have it with trained professionals. They can get help, they can get housing. It's not perfect, but that's, you know, even that is so much further than we've gone. You know, I'm going to say fairly young, because I'm going to say that for as long as possible. But, you know, even in the time that I've been married to my wife, even in the time we've been together, it wasn't legal for the whole time. And, you know, we've only been married for, you know, for 2013. So it's not a long time, you know, since the legalities of it. So definitely a journey. I'm hearing on the history. It's so important to share, make sure people have a voice, and that people are not forgotten what the connotations of certain language used to be, but absolutely reclaiming it and making sure it's used appropriately, especially if we're going to use it.
Can I jump? No, go on, Vic.
Yeah, just on the positive point about where can people go. So I said there were a few people, and kind of I think there are a few, but the few who are very, very positive about sharing their experiences and sharing their knowledge. So within our membership, and now within NAPA, Natalie Ravenscroft deserves a sort of shout out for a lot of the work she's done on around Silver Pride as part of the Belong services. Tonic Housing have done some incredible work, and now pairing up with One Housing to produce the first kind of LGBT housing project in London. Age UK have done some amazing work around particularly older LGBT people. Old Opening Doors London, and they have produced a kind of benchmarking service for organisations who want to understand how they can improve and support their services. So I think there's stuff out there, and I think it is about it moving. You know, people. I think it's back to the leadership point. Really, it's organisations actively and openly questioning. Another example is Sam Monaghan from MHA, who I hear very actively and prominently, you know, talking about inclusion and LGBT services for people they support and for their workforce. You know, those people standing up and saying those messages are a really important part of change. So it's out there, and I you know, and through NCF and through other organisations, people can connect together and think about what they can do. And we certainly, in partnership with a number of different organisations, have produced resources to support people, about supporting people with dementia who are LGBT, and developing services. So there's things there for people who want to make a positive start.
And I think you had some comments.
Yeah, so and while we're doing shout outs, just also the Purple List, if you haven't seen the Purple List play, highly recommend. It is fantastic. I've seen it about 10 times and I cry every single time. So if you haven't, do get a chance to watch that. And Skills for Care with the Confident with different materials, again, really well, you know, great materials, and CQC picked those up and included those in their equality objectives. So another set of really helpful free materials. I just wanted to pick up also on Vic's point about people with dementia and you know, other cognitive impairments. And when we did a tour with the Purple List play actually, and we talked afterwards to the attendees, and we talked to a doctor who had a trans lady come onto the ward, and she was forgetting to take her medication, and they weren't prompting her to take her medication, and her beard grew back, and they just panicked and they didn't know what to do with this lady, so they put her in a side ward. And the doctor said to us at that session, I just feel terrible for not asking, not finding out what we could do, not doing the right thing by that lady. So I think there's definitely, you know, we've got a lot of education, but we need to learn more about what's the right thing to do, be curious, ask those questions.
Danielle?
Yeah, I think just to follow on from what Jane was saying, with that situation you've just described, it could have probably been avoided if there had been an atmosphere within the ward where people felt that they were at ease asking that questions that they would probably should have done. And I suppose it's about, before you get into the sort of the detail of what the policy is, what are we going to do, what actions are we going to take, it's about having a culture more than anything else that encourages asking questions, and without fear of sort of, oh, am I going to look like an idiot, or is someone going to shout at me for asking these questions? It's about creating an environment and a culture. And I'm an employment lawyer, I talk about culture all the time, but it's about having that culture where you do feel like you can ask questions in order to sort of, without fear of sort of any recrimination, or people are going to have a go at you for asking it and say, oh, you idiot, why are you asking that question? It's because some people genuinely just don't know. And I think there is a lot of fear around just asking the question sometimes, which is understandable to a point. No one wants to look like they don't know something, but it's about having an atmosphere where you feel like you can, in order to educate yourself, because if you've got that in place, then I suppose you can then speak freely in order to sort of to get to the point where you can start getting into the detail of everything else that you want to put into practice.
Absolutely. And I think if you do it once, every single time after that becomes a little bit more comfortable, you become a little bit more educated, things get easier, and it feels like a better culture. It feels like a better environment, even as simple as asking people how they'd like to be addressed, or is there any care that is specific care for them that they need whilst they're in, on a ward or in a care home and things like that. It's a great point. Actually, one of the questions we were going to talk about, which links in really well, so I'll just kind of loop it in here, is how do we support people with complex, from the LGBTQ plus individuals with complex conditions or things like this, but also stay within the law, and how do we support appropriately, which obviously follows on from, as you've just said there, Danielle, specifically around culture. Any thoughts on that? Any advice for people on that area?
So is that a question to me specifically, or?
I mean, you can take it, but I'm happy. I'm happy to hear everyone's thoughts.
I don't want to hug the microphone, as it were.
I think you're the legal guy in this one, Daniel. I think you're okay.
Yeah, I think, but it kind of follows on from what I was saying before. A lot of the time, I'll get questions, usually from managers or HR directors or what have you, saying, "Oh, this has happened. What do we do?" And I think some people, when they hear it's an LGBT related issue, they just sort of, if they've not dealt with it before, they just sort of clam up and panic and think, oh, well, we can't do X, Y, and Z because of the Equality Act. And the Equality Act is there for a purpose. It's not there to trip you up or to trap you. It's just, the majority of organisations that I certainly have dealt with anyway, I know they're up on their Equality Act law. There's not really much that I need to teach them. Obviously you get exceptions to that, and you just got to kind of explain to, I had to explain to a client the other day that, you can't just, they had an employee who was trans or identified as trans, and they just sort of panicked and they were asking me all these sorts of questions. And I said, well, what exactly is the issue? And they just said, well, what do we do about it? And I said, well, you just you speak to that person and you treat them like a normal employee, like a normal human being. What more do you want me to say? But I think there is a sort of, and it's through I don't think there's any, certainly you will get organizations where there are individuals who are, I don't know, for want of a better word, bad apples, who, they're going to have these, what I would term sort of bigoted sort of attitudes that they've grown up with. I can't comment on anyone's background, but, they've had these opinions. And when they come into contact with an organization where they do have an equality and diversity policy, and, that they're taught or they're told that they can't just go around saying X, Y, or Z or doing these particular things, then, it's just one of them. I'd say people, certainly the clients that I deal with anyway, there is a great deal of sort of fear and of doing the wrong thing, essentially. And you've got to give people that space in order to to think, oh, well, what can I do here? And just sort of, I don't know, like I said, people panic. And my job is to kind of allay the panic, really, and just say, well, you're not doing anything wrong at the moment, but if you did this that you wanted to do, then we could have an issue on our hands. And I suppose that's the important thing, is to make sure that to not panic. That's my advice. Don't panic.
Not panic, keep asking questions.
Just give me a ring, we'll have a chat about it. I'm sure it's not too bad. We can do something about it.
Well, thank you for that insight. I think that's very similar to, I think, the first word you said, Jane, which was it's about confidence, and being able to ask questions. So thank you for sharing. Hilary, did you have a comment to make on that one? So
I think it's really interesting, this, being afraid to ask questions, and the fear around how that question may be interpreted, or whether it's just rude to ask certain questions about people, about information that might be seen as personal information.
Yeah.
I think something that's helped me many years as a trainer and as a practitioner was saying, there's some questions on this form. Should we just run through them and see what you think? So that they're not my question. And actually, then often you break the ice and people will open up and perhaps share information. It's the form as opposed to my questions. And of course, the form is just there as a tool, actually. It's got nothing to do with the form. We all know that. But it can really help, I think, to enable people to see that not all these questions that I ask might be relevant, but absolutely the ones that are really relevant, and we really need to know that we want to know the answer. We want to know about you. And I think giving people an opportunity to talk about themselves, often people don't get that opportunity to talk about themselves, and enjoy talking about themselves and building that connection with somebody goes a long way to enable us to then provide care later on or immediately that meets this kind of complex scenario, complex set of care and support needs later on, perhaps. So, I think the fear is, yes, feel the fear, because, I don't think I'd want somebody to ask me really personal questions unless I felt really comfortable first. You've got to set the scene. You've got to enable people to feel safe and to trust you, I think, to share information, whatever that information is, whether it's about your finances or your sexuality or your gender. I think there are lots of personal questions that are even the question itself, it depends entirely on people's experience, doesn't it, as to whether or not they're going to feel easily answer those without feeling comfortable first, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and focus on how you interact with people, how you're presenting yourself, and whether you're making people feel comfortable to open up. It's a great positioning, I think, if you're going to go into a conversation like that. Kiran?
I'm flopping a fly away, sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. You keep getting the fly. I'll come back to you if I need to.
I do suppose I do have something to add to that. The fly is looking at me. But I was just going to say, I think what Hilary said about, addressing and asking people questions about maybe how they like to be addressed, or whatever it is, what ethnic minority group you belong to, or whatever. And I think that fear comes from is the Equality Act and all the legislation that was there before it, that became the Equality Act, is there to protect, societies, I suppose, like the protected characteristics of protected groups, is there, and is there for the right reasons. However, the way that maybe it's been portrayed in the media, how it gets portrayed within social media, how it gets the terms, discrimination, harassment, all gets bandied around these terms, it makes it into a bit more of that everyone says, oh, we're being politically correct, we can't do X, Y, and Z. And that's where the fear comes from. And it's really unfortunate that's a piece of legislation that is there to protect those who need to be protected, even in this day and age, because of the way maybe it's been portrayed amongst peers, amongst our family, and then the way that people will try and use it to suit their own purposes when they need to use it. And I'm sure we've seen all these posts on social media where people go, oh, it's discrimination and I'm going to go after so-and-so or whatever. And it's such a shame, because then it actually stops us having those honest conversations. And I'm just talking, and I know we're not talking about ethnicity, but as being an Indian woman, I would actually, somebody ask me where I'm from, because people get very confused as to what my ethnicity is and where I'm from, rather than them maybe make an assumption and actually call me a derogatory term. Like I've had that many times. I'd rather people just ask me, but everybody is different, and not everyone, a lot of people are scared because of the legislation that is actually there to protect pretty much everybody, because we all do have one of those protected characteristics or fall within one of those. So it's such a shame, really, isn't it? And again, that's culture, and that has to change before people understand actually what is this legislation for and how it can actually be properly used.
Yeah, I think when the shield becomes the sword, this is something that was put there to protect and help people, and it actually becomes something that can be used against, then it's it's misuse of it, I think, as well, in a lot of ways. Or it's an education piece.
It also ridiculed as well, which is such a shame.
To flip this over a little bit, and we have had a question around this, which is I'm scrolling one moment. So some of the challenges that is faced is not with actual carers treating clients in a certain way or indifferent in any way. It's actually sometimes clients treating staff or carers in an inappropriate way. So do you have any advice, any ideas, anything you can share that helps with changing client attitudes or supports with that? So this is kind of the other side of the field, if you like.
I mean, I think, again, there's a lot of these poor leaders out there, but, a lot of it is from about how staff are supported to do that. I mean, I think, homophobia or transphobia, or however that this might be described in this kind of context, is just one of the things that happens within care homes or care settings and perhaps doesn't go unchallenged. I would say that there's an awful lot of sexism as well that is very active within care settings, with a lot of and undoubtedly a lot of racism that happens, and I think this is about how leaders create a safe space for people to work within and for people to receive care and support within. And I think it's absolutely about people feeling able to challenge that in a supportive way, not in a punitive way, in a way which is about recognizing that people's opinions and people's perspectives are shaped out of, whether you see it as out of ignorance or whether you see it as out of a poor experience, or it's taking time with both the person who's received that insult or that homophobia, but also taking time with the person who has said it to understand where those perspectives come from, but very actively to challenge them and for them to be seen to be challenged. And I think this is about creating an environment that people are respected for what they bring. We're talking about seeing people as individuals, and everybody needs to be able to kind of thrive in that environment. But it's definitely about giving people permission to challenge and giving people support when they are, when they've been challenged, to have some time to talk that through and to understand, what, just as we would in a staff-to-staff environment, what the impact of that behaviour is on somebody.
I like that. And then again, building relationships back up so that both client and carer or staff have a safe space to work and to live, if that's the case, if it's a care home maybe. obviously if it's in your own home and if it's something you're not educated about and feel strongly about, I can imagine as an individual that's might be confusing, might be challenging, but it's like you say, it's about creating safe places and leadership challenging that and saying, here's what we expect, here's what we allow, here's what we want to be. Culture,
Yeah.
you know, that's the culture we want.
Well, and I think giving people the language that is right, is acceptable. I mean, you know, we talked quite a bit already about people's fear of getting things wrong, and things change and terms change, and, you know, the things that maybe were positive. You know, Mike's talked about the sort of reclamation of queer as a word and as a bit of language, and, you know, if you're from a particular generation, you may never want to reclaim that as a piece of positive language, but if you're of a younger generation, it might be something you choose to describe yourself as, and I think that's quite hard for everybody to understand. So I think some of it is about saying, what, you know, what do I, if you're talking about me and you don't wish to offend me, then this is what this is the language that I would prefer you to use.
Great. Was there any other comments on that one, Hilary?
Just in terms of on leadership again, I just think also what's the expectation around sharing personal information? And I think that is something, you know, and the boundaries around, you know, because I think I've certainly worked in organisations where staff members with families would come in and share about their weekend and what they've been up to, and an expectation perhaps that their partner is opposite sex to them and that their children were born to them, and all of those things that get really complicated. And I think sometimes the leadership, you know, from a leadership point of view, it's okay to say to your staff, share what you feel comfortable with. And if you need to challenge something and you need some support to do that, you know, talk to somebody that you trust within the team about how to do that, and check your policy, go back to your policies and procedures. But I think there's this expectation sometimes of staff that if we're being person-centered, we must give personal information of ourselves. And sometimes that doesn't feel safe for staff members either. So I think, you know, to be clear and say, share what feels comfortable. And if you're asked direct questions about yourself, it's okay to give an answer that feels, don't feel you have to share because you're asked the question. And I think I've certainly been asked really, really personal questions by people that I supported as a care worker and as an activity worker, but I didn't always want to answer. And I think, you know, there's that expectation sometimes that you have to share or lie if it's something that potentially might cause an uncomfortable silence or a challenge. You know, what is the expectation really around sharing information about yourself? And I don't know how many care and activity teams are really that sure about how much they're supposed to share. It's about professional boundaries again, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was asked in not at QCS, in a previous role, when did I come out? And I was like, well, which time? Because obviously there's every role, every time you meet a new person, and it's not just as, you know, someone within this particular community, it's how many times have you come out as a woman in leadership, or how many times have you come out to say that you like crocheting, you know, whatever the actual thing is. We do find ourselves in situations where we have to offer personal information because that's the nature of the conversation. So I think, you know, to your point there around training, it would be great to have you know, facilitated support in documentation with this, whether that's a policy or a procedure, or it's just here's a how-to guide, or, you know, something simple that organizations can use to say, this is how we have conversations like this is how we agree to communicate with each other, which I think is, you know, it's a great point there. Mike?
The caution I would just add to what you just said there is, yes, I think that's all great, but I think we live in a period of time where a lot of us seem to just want absolutes of things right or wrong or blah, blah, blah. We know how polarized our society is at the moment on all sorts of different issues. And as somebody who's been a trainer for many, many years now, I have to try and make it clear to learners that the role of training is not to provide absolutes and say this is right and that is wrong, or to fix people so that they think or behave in the right way. So I would just say, I often say on training, you know, it's not one extreme or the other. It's all the grey stuff that lies in between. And in terms of the topic that we're discussing here today, in dementia care, Tom Kitwood said, when you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia. And I think you could easily translate that into when you've met one LGBT plus person, you've met one LGBT plus person. It's not a homogenous group who all have the same needs or experiences. So I just caution for people who might listen in to think that there's a right or wrong way of doing it. There's not. And the more that we are prepared to say, hey, I don't know how we do this, have I used the right expression there? And allow people to feel, particularly in training in this context. I remember doing a course years ago where we had one participant that throughout the day was winding up other participants because she kept saying quite homophobic things. And I was co-training and I said, let's not challenge her, because let the participants do the challenging, not us as the trainers. And it happened to be that I'm a gay man and my co-trainer was a lesbian woman. And this woman had stayed on at the end and she said, oh, I've really learned so much, but I've never met any lesbian or gay people. And one of the participants said, but those two are. And then the participant went, really? And that's the point I'm trying to get across, that we particularly, I've got a passion for this as a trainer. We mustn't stifle people saying what their true, genuine thoughts and beliefs are about LGBT people and issues, because if we stifle it, we're not going to be able to work with it and explore other alternative perceptions. I've droned on again, so I'm going to stop there.
No, I appreciate your views, Mike.
I do think it's really important. What Mike's saying is that, if you've met one person, it's not the whole. It is one person, and I think that's really important. That's why I think I start always from the perspective of just, that it is very individual. I feel quite strongly it's got to be built around trust and respect. The culture that you create has got to be built around those two things, and then the rest will follow eventually. Because if you don't have that, and that's whether you're a resident with that sort of view, if you don't expect your residents to respect the staff, that also doesn't work, so it's the individuality. And we talk about personalization all the time. We talk about it. So everybody's needs, everybody's beliefs, everybody's individuality has to be celebrated, but it has to be celebrated not only by the workforce, it has to be celebrated by everybody in a way that we feel comfortable, in our own skins. And I think, questions I get asked about where I come from all the time, and I say Kent, and I know why they're asking, but it's quite an interesting way of asking without asking. And I'm not being difficult, but how relevant is that question to the environment that I'm in? If it's a social environment where I trust somebody, where I respect them, and they ask me the question, that's different to being asked it on the train, on the way home, So I think it's really important to have that respect and trust in place, and also the parameters of the acceptability of behaviour has got to fall within the whole, it's not just the management team, not just the owners, it's everybody who is in that environment.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So obviously there are things we can consider. Are there any other challenges that you think providers might face in meeting this requirement, in focusing on LGBT service users? Are there any other kind of advice that we could give of things they might see along the line when they start to look at this?
I think just to kind of add, when I was thinking about this sort of question around challenges, and I think Mike maybe mentioned this earlier, it's about looking at your data as well. Rather, small, large, medium-sized providers, who is actually using your services, because you can't provide services or build up. Sorry, this fly's still harassing me. Sorry. You can't build, you can't deliver services if you don't actually know who's using them. So having a look at your data, and actually be meaningful data, not just your regular tick box about, okay, well, we've got 1 lesbian and we've got 3 gay people. Well, what does that actually mean? Like, it's great because, like I said, I'm a public sector background, so I've seen actually what that data does, and it's like, oh great, we can sing about these 4 people out of 330,000 people who are using our services because they're from this community, so let's sing about those 4 people. But it's kind of a bit like, well, it has to be meaningful. So that's a challenge that I believe that actually as a provider service, that that needs to be looked at, but also as a service user, is having that confidence and being comfortable to be able to actually tick that box to say that they belong to whichever protected group it is. So it's not just about the service providers or the people who are accessing those services. I think we've talked a lot about this with the last hour. It's about looking at that culture as well. And also it makes good business sense as well, doesn't it? Reputationally, you don't want to be known as being an organisation that is not doesn't I don't know, maybe is not inclusive to the LGBTQ plus community, or to the an ethnic minority community. So it makes good business sense that actually reputationally you want to be seen as being inclusive, but not ticking a box to say that you're inclusive. So everything has to be meaningful as much as it can be, without actually, I always have a big bugbear about not listening to those who shout the loudest as well. So it's making sure that it's equitable to as much as it and as far as it can be.
Yeah, great points. Thank you. Vic?
I just think that some of this is about thinking about, how celebration of difference in a way. We talked a lot about kind of problems and challenges, and actually, some of what we would really be thinking about encouraging care providers to do is to think about the positives, and think about the sort of ways in which, whether or not there are people who are LGBT plus within your existing services, that you're still celebrating the fact you're part of a community which has LGBT plus people as part of it, and I think thinking about some of the partnerships that might usefully come from that. So are there local organizations that you might work with? Are there people within the community who could support you in terms of trying to change some of the thinking within organizations? I think it's a great opportunity for organizations to really test themselves in terms of thinking about how they could be really, really positive about this as a great sort of step forward in terms of really embracing the needs of the LGBT plus community, both for staff and for those who use those care and support services. So strongly encourage it, and very happy to help in any way that we can.
Thank you for that. Mike?
Two very quick things. When Kiran was speaking, I just realized that we haven't really mentioned relatives and what I call significant others, because for LGBT plus people, it might be a friend that they've known for years and years that is the person that knows them best, rather than a next of kin. And I was just reminded of a former boss of mine who's a lesbian woman living in Wales, where I'm from originally. She's moved back there, and her mum is in a care home. She said they're so LGBT positive in their policies, and she's very political, so it's really good that she could say that about the home. And the other thing I would say, and it's kind of a bit of a plug for NAPA here, is that it doesn't have to always have this LGBT plus sort of banner on it. But what NAPA have been doing with their monthly activities calendar is including activities that are inclusive of LGBT plus individuals. So, for example, this month's included some photos of individuals that are LGBT plus icons from history. But other people doing the activities will be able to name those individuals as well. So it doesn't always have to have that label, we don't have to just say, oh, now we're going to have an LGBT plus activity.
This is the specific one.
Make it systemic.
Yeah.
And that can tease up conversations, and that's where staff need to be trained to then have conversations with those who might have more outdated views.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. We're just at about time. I don't know about you, but that's gone very fast. But thank you so much for all of your comments. I feel enlightened. I feel very motivated to go and see what else I can do and how much more we can support. And I think, you know, almost everyone said it's around celebrating differences. And I love that phrase. I think that's a great takeaway. So again, thank you so much. The recording will be available soon. We will answer the questions and send them out. And hopefully we'll see you all again sometime. Right, goodbye, everyone. Thank you.